The guards were still at their posts. The servants were still preparing the morning meal. Couriers were still arriving from the eastern provinces, carrying dispatches addressed to the most powerful man alive. The palace machinery of Persepolis kept moving, perfectly, obediently, without a single interruption. But behind one specific door, in one specific chamber at the heart of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever built, the King of Kings was already dead. Not dying, not wounded, dead. His body already cold on the floor of a room that no soldier dared to enter without permission. His killer, the man responsible for his personal safety, had already walked back out through those same doors, straightened his uniform, and returned to his duties. What followed was not a coup announced with trumpets and fire. It was something far more disturbing. For 3 days, maybe longer depending on which account you trust, the Persian Empire ran itself. Officials issued orders, armies held their positions, taxes were collected, all of it conducted in the name of a man whose lungs had stopped working. Nobody told the truth, not the killer, not the guards, not the men who discovered the body. Because in an empire built entirely on the myth of one man's invincibility, admitting that the God King was gone was more terrifying than pretending he was still there. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me what city and country you're watching from. And if you're not subscribed yet, do it now. You're watching The Forgotten Fuse. To understand why the death of Xerxes happened the way it did, in silence, in darkness, by the hands of his own protectors, you have to understand what Xerxes had become by the time that blade found him. In 480 BC, he had been the most feared ruler on earth. He had personally overseen the construction of a bridge across the Hellespont, 2 parallel lines of ships lashed together with massive cables, forming a floating road nearly a mile long across open sea. When a storm tore the first version apart, Xerxes ordered the water itself to be punished. 300 lashes delivered to the surface of the strait, chains thrown into the depths to symbolically bind the sea to his will. This was not madness, this was theater, deliberate, calculated spectacle designed to project one message into the minds of every soldier, every subject, every enemy watching. This man does not negotiate with nature, he commands it. The army he marched west was staggering in scale. Ancient sources throw numbers like 1.7 million at you, which no modern historian takes literally. But even the conservative estimates, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 soldiers, represented something no Greek city-state had ever faced. Soldiers from every corner of his domain: Medes, Persians, Egyptians, Indians, Ethiopians. A migrating empire with weapons. He burned Athens. He breached Thermopylae. He stood on the Acropolis and watched smoke pour from the most sacred buildings in the Greek world. By every visible measure, Xerxes was winning. Then came Salamis, the narrow strait between the island and the mainland where Themistocles of Athens lured the Persian fleet into a trap it couldn't escape. The Persian warships were enormous, built for open water, for intimidation, for crushing enemy formations through sheer mass. In the tight channel at Salamis, those same advantages became death sentences. They couldn't maneuver. They collided with each other. Greek triremes with their bronze rams punched through hull after hull, while the Persian sailors drowned in water they had been promised they would rule. Xerxes watched from a golden throne set on a hillside above the battle. He watched his navy dissolve in front of him. He watched the myth he had spent years constructing crack open like pottery. He went home. He left his general Mardonius with a substantial force to finish the conquest, a force that would be annihilated the following year at Plataea, and he retreated to Persepolis. The King of Kings returned to his palace not as a conqueror completing his triumphal circuit, but as a man who needed 4 walls around him. What happened inside those walls over the following decade is where this story actually begins. Persepolis was not simply a royal residence. It was a machine, an architectural expression of absolute power, engineered to make every person who entered it feel the weight of Achaemenid authority pressing down from every surface. The Apadana, the great audience hall, had 72 columns, each standing nearly 20 meters tall. The reliefs carved into its stairways depicted delegations from every nation in the empire bringing tribute. Lydians with gold cups, Indians with axes and cloth, Ethiopians with elephant tusks. An endless stone parade of submission frozen in permanent display. This was the world Xerxes retreated into after Greece. And a man who retreats from an external failure into a closed, controlled environment where his word is absolute and no one dares to contradict him does not tend to improve. The historical record, fragments of it preserved by Greek writers like Ctesias, by Persian administrative documents, by later accounts, paints a portrait of a king who stopped looking outward. The ambitious campaigns, the grand engineering projects, the deliberate cultivation of terror as policy that had defined his earlier reign, all of it contracted. What expanded was the interior world of the palace. The harem, the court intrigue, the slow, suffocating politics of a closed system where proximity to the king was the only currency that mattered, and where that proximity was controlled by a small number of people who understood exactly how to exploit it. Among those people was a man named Artabanus, not a minor functionary, not a distant relative with a nominal title. Artabanus held one of the most powerful positions in the Persian court, commander of the royal bodyguard. The Hazarapatish, the man personally responsible for the physical safety of the king. He knew every guard rotation. He knew every access point to the royal quarters. He knew which doors were watched and which were not. He knew the exact rhythm of palace life, when the king slept, when he ate, when he was alone. And over the years following Salamis, as he watched Xerxes withdraw deeper into the palace world and the court politics around him grew more volatile, Artabanus made a calculation, a cold, patient, exceptionally dangerous calculation. He began building something. Not an army, not a public alliance, something quieter and far more lethal. A network of men inside the palace who were loyal to him rather than to the throne. Men who understood that Xerxes, the returning failure, the king who had promised to swallow Greece and come back half-digested, was no longer the same symbol of invincible divine authority he had once been. The question Artabanus was asking himself, the question that every ambitious man inside a weakened royal court eventually asks, was simple. If the God King is no longer godlike, what exactly is stopping someone from taking what he has? The ancient sources disagree on the precise details of what happened in August of 465 BC. This is not unusual. Palace assassinations are by definition events that happen in the dark, witnessed by people with every incentive to misremember, lie, or simply stay silent. What the sources agree on is the basic structure. Artabanus moved at night. He had prepared carefully. The men he needed were in place. The access he required was his by virtue of his official position. No one questioned the commander of the royal guard walking through the palace corridors at night. That was his job. He reached the royal chamber. What happened inside that room took seconds. Xerxes, the man who had lashed the sea, who had burned Athens, who had once commanded the largest army in the ancient world, died without the opportunity to defend himself. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final words recorded for history, just the gap between one breath and the absence of the next. Artabanus walked back out, and then he did something that reveals exactly how carefully he had planned this moment. He did not immediately announce a succession. He did not produce a candidate. He did not show himself. He went to Darius, the eldest son of Xerxes, the natural heir to the throne, and told him that his brother Artaxerxes had committed the murder. Think about that choice for a moment. Artabanus had just killed the king. He now had two princes, Darius and Artaxerxes. each of whom represented a potential rival for the throne he intended to control. The obvious move would be to eliminate both of them immediately. But Artabanus understood something more subtle. A puppet is more useful than a corpse, provided you control which puppet is holding the strings. His plan was to use Darius to eliminate Artaxerxes, and then, once the elder prince had served his purpose, to remove him as well, leaving Artabanus as the power behind whoever was left standing. It nearly worked. Darius, grieving and furious, armed himself. He went to confront his brother. But Artabanus had miscalculated one thing. Megabyzus, one of the most powerful military commanders in the empire, and a man whose loyalty Artabanus had overestimated, was present when Darius confronted Artaxerxes. And in the confusion and violence of that encounter, it was Artaxerxes, not Darius, who survived. Now Artabanus had one prince left, and that prince was asking questions. Here is what makes this story genuinely extraordinary, the detail that separates it from ordinary palace violence and turns it into something that should have collapsed an empire. For somewhere between 2 and 3 days after the assassination of Xerxes, possibly longer, the Persian Empire continued to function as if nothing had happened. No public announcement, no succession ceremony, no official acknowledgement that the man whose name was on every administrative document, whose divine authority underpinned every law and every military command from Egypt to the borders of India, was dead on the floor of his bedroom. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice made by everyone who knew the truth, because every single one of them understood what the alternative looked like. The Persian Empire was an authority structure built on a single point of failure. The king was not just a ruler. He was the living embodiment of Ahura Mazda's will on earth. His legitimacy was not political in the modern sense. It was cosmic. To announce that this figure was dead, murdered, his body lying unattended in a palace room, was to announce that the entire foundation of the world's largest empire had just been kicked out from under it. Provincial governors receiving orders would wonder, from whom? Military commanders in the field would ask, whose authority? The subject nations held in place by the combination of Persian military power and the psychological weight of royal invincibility would ask, is the weight still there? And ambitious men everywhere, in every province, in every garrison, in every noble household with its own private calculation about power, would begin doing the mathematics. So the guards stayed at their posts. The servants prepared meals that were never eaten. The couriers delivered their dispatches and received responses written in a dead man's name. The machinery ran on momentum and on the shared, unspoken understanding that the first person to say the true thing out loud would bring everything down on everyone. 3 days. An empire of millions held together by silence. Artabanus had one prince left, and a plan that was already fraying at the edges. He moved quickly. He approached Artaxerxes with the same manipulation he had used on Darius, positioning himself as a loyal advisor, a protective figure, the experienced hand that the young prince needed to navigate the dangerous waters ahead. For a brief period, it appeared to be working. Artaxerxes was young. He was shaken. His father was dead, his brother was dead, and the man standing in front of him seemed to be the only stable thing in the room. Artabanus was trusted. He was given access. He was permitted to continue operating at the center of power. What he did not account for was Megabyzus. Megabyzus was not a man who could be easily manipulated. He was one of the most experienced military commanders in the empire, a member of the old Persian nobility, and a man who had watched Artabanus's maneuvers with growing clarity about where they were leading. He went to Artaxerxes privately. What he told the young king we can only reconstruct from the outcome, but the outcome is unambiguous. Artaxerxes moved against Artabanus, suddenly, decisively, with the kind of violence that young rulers deploy when they finally understand that hesitation is its own form of suicide. The man who had killed the King of Kings, who had orchestrated the deaths of 2 princes, who had held the Persian Empire in suspended animation for 3 days while he positioned himself for total control. Artabanus was taken and executed. Some accounts say he attempted to assassinate Artaxerxes directly when he realized the situation had reversed. That he got close enough to wound the young king before being killed by the guards who had, until that moment, been following his orders. Whether that specific detail is accurate or a later embellishment is impossible to verify. What is certain is that Artabanus died inside the palace he had thought he owned. Artaxerxes I took the throne. He would reign for 40 years, one of the longer reigns in Achaemenid history, and would be remembered as a relatively stable and capable ruler. The empire did not collapse. The machine that had run itself for 3 days on momentum and silence absorbed the shock and kept moving. Here is the part of this story that no ancient chronicler quite says out loud, but that sits underneath every line of every account. The 3 days of silence were not a failure of the system. They were the system working exactly as designed. The Persian Empire had built itself around the concept of royal invincibility so thoroughly that even the reality of royal death could not immediately penetrate the structure. The bureaucrats kept filing their reports because the alternative, acknowledging that the center of their world had vanished, was more dangerous than the fiction. The guards stayed at their posts because their entire identity was built around the duty, not the man. The couriers kept riding because they were riding for the institution, not the individual. Empires do not run on kings. They run on the idea of kings. And ideas, it turns out, are considerably harder to assassinate than men. Artabanus had understood how to kill Xerxes. He had not understood how to kill Persia. And that gap in his comprehension, the difference between ending a life and ending a system, is what destroyed him. The Greece that Xerxes had failed to conquer would go on to produce philosophers who argued about the nature of legitimate government, generals who would eventually challenge Persia again, and ultimately a Macedonian king named Alexander, who would burn Persepolis to the ground in 330 BC. Some ancient sources say Alexander ordered the destruction as deliberate revenge for what Xerxes had done to Athens 150 years earlier. Whether or not that motivation was genuine, the image is striking. The palace that Xerxes had retreated into after Salamis, the walls that had absorbed his failure and his declining years, the corridors where Artabanus had walked in the dark on the night of the assassination, the throne room where Artaxerxes had eventually confronted the truth. All of it reduced to the same ash that Xerxes had made of the Acropolis. History keeping its own kind of ledger. The King of Kings was dead for 3 days before his empire admitted it. The man who killed him was undone not by the armies of Greece or the gods of Persia, but by a single general who decided that loyalty to the institution outweighed loyalty to the man who had corrupted it. Xerxes had lashed the sea. He had burned Athens. He had built a bridge of ships across an entire strait and marched an empire across it. And in the end, he was taken in the dark, in silence, by someone who knew exactly which doors were left unguarded. Power is not the same thing as safety. It never was. If this story hit you the way it hit me when I first went deep into the sources, subscribe, hit the like button, and drop your city and country in the comments below. Every comment, every like tells the algorithm that real history deserves to be seen. You've been watching The Forgotten Fuse. We'll see you in the next one.